And welcome back. We are now, of course, going to start our next type of animation, which is a frame-by-frame animation. So I went ahead and imported both this boy and this rock sprite here into my canvas. And you can see that they are each on their own layer here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start by saying I want this to be about a 2-second animation. So let's go ahead and insert frames up to 2 seconds here. And once that's done, the next thing I need to do is I'm going to go back to my first frame here. And I'm actually going to animate this boy here so that his limbs are moving. Now, it's not going to be perfect because he is a static image rather than having distinct sprites for each different pose. But for the purpose of our exercise, this will work here today. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to want to go ahead and effectively lasso out his arms and his legs and kind of make those into their own symbols. So if I were to select his arm here, of course it's going to right now select the whole boy, and that's because it's treating this as one object. So I'm going to right click and use the break apart command, and you can see he is now being this kind of textured dot here. And I'm just going to use the last tool. I can start outside the canvas, and I'm just going to go ahead and trace over his arm. It's not okay if it's not perfect because again we're just kind of learning here today. And that will, of course, isolate the arm into its own region. Once I've done that, I can then right-click on that region, and I'm going to convert that to a symbol. And I'm just going to go ahead and call this arm, and we're going to make sure our type is graphic. And since this looks like this might be his left arm, I might, of course, append that with left. So that's left arm. And you can see now we have a left arm symbol. In fact, I can pull that off of his body there, and we now have a left arm. And what I want to do, of course, is when I'm working with this arm here in this symbol, you can see there's this center dot here. I want to make sure that center dot, of course, eventually gets moved on over. So I'm going to switch to my sub-selection tool here. And, actually my selection tool. And I want to make sure that this center dot, because this is kind of effectively the center of this object. So let's go our free transform tool. We want to move that closer to the pivot point here. So where his arm is, and I can move that, of course, back to the main body. And then let's repeat that same process now, though, for the rest of it. So I'm going to use the lasso tool again. And what I want to do this time is maybe take his back leg here and select that. And then I can, of course, right-click, convert to symbol. And this is his left leg. And we'll repeat here for the right leg as well. And we may just have this one just hinge at the knee. And that might be enough just for what we're going to work with today. We can do more with this if we need to, but that will be plenty for what we're going to work with. Again, going to free transform tool, let's move that pivot point up into more of a anchor where the leg would actually bend. And click on this symbol, move that pivot point up. All right, now that this is all broken apart into the different components, the next thing to do is to go hard and look at this boy here and say, where do we want him to be? Well, we want him maybe to end up just on the other side of this rock. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this timeline for him and choose convert to frame by frame animation. And you can see we get several options in here. We have the ability to keyframe several different times, or we can create our own custom keyframe. For now, let's just choose to keyframe every 4th frame. That's going to give us into kind of a nice even division here for these 2 seconds. And what I want that to do is, for example, he's going to start here, but then at the next keyframe, I can then go to these symbols that I created, keeping it on my free transform tool, and I can begin to rotate the individual body components here. So that way he is looking much more like he is in a run. So if I were just to, of course, look between those 2 animated pieces, you can, of course, see how that is starting to play out here. Then we can, of course, go to frame 10. We can repeat that same process. And you can see quickly how we can get this animation to move. We can even scooch this leg in a little bit so it looks more like he's ready to jump. You can move that arm a little bit if we want. And of course, this is going to blend this animation together. And what I might want to do is now at this point I might say, you know, here's the last animation that I had. Now I can move him up, for example. So I'm going to grab this whole character and I can move him, but notice it did leave his arms and legs behind. So I want to make sure that when I do this, I select every component. And so now we're going to have him start to jump. And of course I can bring those limbs back together if I want. Don't want to move the rock there. Go to frame 20 now. And again, we can move him into position. And we can, of course, again, adjust everything. So I'm just going to go ahead and pause the video. And I want you to go ahead and continue working with this animation here. And when we come back, I'll show you our finished product. So again, let's go ahead and just make this so that every couple frames he's moving up. And then we want him so that way when he's done, he's going to end up here on the other side of this rock. And welcome back. We had now, of course, have created a frame-by-frame animation, and let's just go ahead and see the animation effect. And so when I play my animation through, you can see the boy now it jumps up and over the rock, and all that has done is allowed us to have some level of control as we move through each of these frames here. So which is pretty cool here. Now obviously we could do this with even more fine control if we had, for example, different sprites that had him in his individual poses. So we didn't have these weird kind of effects when we start breaking things apart. And the sprites, of course, you can see have these like white gaps and stuff like that. So we could, of course, if we had these each individual symbols, so for example, if his arms were their own layer and his legs were their own layer, then we could make this look a lot more smoother in presentation. But for today's purpose, this works great. It kind of helps show us what we need to do to create a frame-by-frame animation. Now, one thing I do want to show real quick is you'll notice right here at the end, even though I have a animation here, you can see there's one more kind of keyframe right here at the end. And that's because if you were going to go ahead and create one more animation, so let's just say right before he jumps here, let's say we want him to wave his arm, I can grab this arm here and add in another motion, and you can see that it'll automatically add in additional keyframes here for me based upon that motion. And so if I replay this now, back from the beginning here, you can see we have additional motion here. So the nice thing is, but once we create that frame-by-frame animation, if we need to go in and create additional frames, we don't need to go ahead and create a whole nother frame-by-frame animation. Of course, we started with the keyframe every fourth frame, but the program is smart enough to recognize that when we add in additional new movements, it's simply going to go ahead and create those additional keyframes for us. Another way to think about this is very similar to how when we were working with Photoshop and we went ahead and created our individual frames for everything. A keyframe is another way of thinking of those individual frames that we had in Photoshop. And so every time we're effectively adding a keyframe here is the same thing as how we would add those frames in Photoshop. And just like in Photoshop, when we could have different duration for those frames, we can have different duration here for the individual animation aspects.